Today on Rebuilders, we explore something that we've received actually a lot of questions about. What are we talking about, Mark?
We are looking at elite power, corruption, and conspiracy theories in contemporary society. As institutions are delegitimized, as people lose trust in the institutions that once guided the narrative, we see conspiracy theories arising everywhere. How are we interpret them? What's a biblical way of looking at this? All that and more today on Rebuilders.
Yeah, we look forward to sharing the episode with you. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both?
Yeah, I'm good. I think Daniel's a bit... He's had the wind knocked out of his sails. He's lost his banter confidence.
I don't get heaps of airtime on this podcast. I feel like banter is...
Is that something you want to bring up with us on air?
Yeah.
I'm okay with it. I enjoy the conversation that you guys contribute to 90% of. However, banter is just a great space for me to contribute. And it was banned last week.
Oh, okay.
And I'd like it formally. I'd like it reinstated.
Well, what Daniel is saying, there's a small percentage of our audience which doesn't like our banter, so we thought we'd just do a non-banter episode last week. But
yeah,
Daniel, what he's saying here, and we've been confronted, we've been called out on air that we talk the most, but where he feels his contribution is with banter. So by removing the banter, you almost remove Daniel.
Yeah.
And
welcome back, Daniel.
And his heart.
The people have spoken. They want their banter back.
Good. But do you have any banter for us this week, or is this the banter?
We had some pre-show banter around. We're talking about custard.
Oh, custard. Man.
Is that an international food? Custard?
I'm sure there's some
food.
countries which don't eat it. I'm sure it's not like found throughout human civilization in every group throughout history.
The Aztecs love their custard.
Yeah. All right. Well, so we've entered into winter, and I am privy to a dessert on a weekend. And so last weekend I decided, rather than ice cream, which is more for the warmer months, you'd say, I went for a pie and custard. For my dessert.
I'm assuming a sweet pie.
It was a sweet pie, yep.
Can you tell me whether you heated up your custard or whether you had it cold?
Well, I had two pies.
Oh my goodness, this is confessional.
Different nights.
What flavour pie?
It was a apple and berry, and blueberry maybe. But one night I did warm up my custard.
I just don't like custard. This is incredible. You warmed up. Yeah. Can I just say, I can see the life returning to Daniel. I mean, they're cracking up. Liddy and Daniel's cracking up. And Daniel has just come back. Warmed up his custard. They're crying.
I cannot believe this is the type of banter we've returned to.
Yeah, this is what we returned to.
I've come back too strong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that was
the
beautiful.
non-banter people are just hitting that fast forward for 15 seconds.
All right. Well, to all my custard lovers out there, I see you. Power on.
Custard's last stand.
Which is how we got onto the subject, but we won't. Yeah. We digress.
Yes. We do.
Daniel's sort of flirting with another podcast. The rest is history.
It is a good podcast. Look, I'm as a historian.
Oh, this is fantastic.
As a self-professed historian.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
All right. Let's bring it back.
Okay, we're bringing it back. Yes, The Rest is History is a great podcast.
Yes.
Thank you for bringing it up.
Can I do a segue?
Yes, you absolutely can.
Well, The Rest of History is presented by Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And Dominic Sandbrook wrote a book called Mad as Hell, The Rise of the Populist Right in America in the 1970s. I think that's the
right.
title.
Yeah.
And he talked about in the 1970s
You actually got it here in your notes. How did you manage that?
I haven't.
You do?
I know.
Oh. I didn't anticipate this was going to happen. Go on.
Well, just sit back and watch the magic. Just watch the podcasting magic.
Oh, astounding.
He posits that in the 1970s, when interest rates rose, inflation went higher, there was an oil crisis and proxy wars across the world, and a sense of malaise came over the population, a sense that we were heading towards an apocalyptic end of environmentalism or World War III, that at that time, conspiracy theories began to rise in the American population.
And that is a great segue because it leads into what we're talking about today. Obviously, one of the things that you've noted about what's happening across society is this delegitimization of institutions. And we've received a lot of questions. Our listeners are asking, as this happens, this
It's hard to say, isn't it? Delegitimization.
Yes, delegitimization of institutions. They're seeing these other entities emerge, like World Economic Forum, and we're receiving a lot of questions about whether we should be concerned about this. Are they wielding too much power?
Yeah.
What implications are there for society? So we're going to be exploring some of that today.
So I think that one thing that marks our moment, you're right, is that delegitimization of institutions. And then accompanying that is a questioning of the truth that those who command from the heights of society have, put out into the world. And so you get this continuum from, almost there's almost two polarities at the moment in the world. There is what is termed as conspiracy theories. And then on the other side, there is sort of, those who are trying to debunk, work against misinformation, disinformation, and there just seems to be two polarities.
Sure.
But you have this sense that people increasingly have lost trust in elites and the establishment. One of the things that just marks across the board, particularly the left and the right, is just a loss of trust in the commanding narratives. This is something we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So what I thought would be good today is just to pick it apart. Are all conspiracy theories wrong? Do you have to fit into these two camps? And just to give you some sort of examples. One particular example is, recently, more information came out to light. It's been slowly sort of dripping out in the last few days, or sort of couple of weeks, some information that's come to light around September 11th. September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center, and at the time there was sort of a pushing back on sort of questioning of the official narrative around it. Now, then conspiracy theories come up in the midst of everything from, it was an inside job, that you had documentaries like Loose Change by Alex Jones, and you had this sort of takeoff of a number of conspiracy theories around the attacks on the World Trade Center.
Yep.
People were blaming, Israel, people were blaming, there was some percentage of people who actually blamed that it was a second Pearl Harbor by Japan, so all these kinds of different things. How did different buildings fall, with the explosives, all these kinds. There's a whole vast panorama of conspiracy theories around September 11th.
Yes.
But then some of the information that has been sort of released of late, I think it was a couple months ago, I think it was MI6 released a video of, I think his name is Bayoumi, who was an official who the Western intelligence agencies has now been released, believe was a Saudi, I think it's the MID, Ministry of Intelligence or whatever, directorate at, basically the Saudi CIA. And he was at a party with two of the hijackers. And then more information's been released that, possibly what the Western intelligence agencies had information that you had a Saudi official who seemed to be the handler of two of the 9/11 hijackers. Now, what this says is that there was possibly sections of the Saudi intelligence or Saudi government or possibly the Saudi government who had some knowledge of September 11th. Now, that's something that was written off as a conspiracy theory not too long ago. Now, some of the sort of geopolitical machinations around that as the current Saudi regime, led by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, have been putting pressure on the Biden government, who they're not as much fans of. They would prefer to have Trump in. They've been playing hardball in some of the negotiations around the releasing of oil. So the releasing of this information about 9/11 is a way of saying, hey, we've got dirt on you guys and you play hardball with us, we're going to play hardball with you. And all of a sudden what you start to see is you don't see the conspiracy theory of like, George Bush was going from floor to floor putting dynamite in, like the World Trade Center of the extreme. But hang on, there's something here which we weren't told. And there's obviously something here that there's redacted or secret information that the US government has not revealed. Donald Trump came out this week and said, I'm going to release all the information on 9/11, the killing of JFK, the killing of RFK, Senior, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother. He's going to release it all. Now, he actually did say this. Interestingly, he said he was going to release all of the information the first time he got in. He actually said he'd heard of what was in some of the documents, so he's going to release it. However, then when he got into office, he didn't do that. But just the fact that you know that there is information on something like the John F. Kennedy killing that has not been released means there's stuff out there that the public does not know.
Yes.
So there's actually this interesting middle space where you have this stuff going on in the world where we don't know necessarily everything, and it's not like the official narrative is always true. Just to go to an example from Australian history, you know, in World War II, when Japan began its attack on places like Pearl Harbor, you know, we had in the north of Australia, the city of Darwin was bombed, and the media reports at the time was that the attack was at a particular scale, and what people found out many years later was the attacks on Darwin were far worse.
Yeah.
Now, the Australian government made a decision to not panic the country, to not release the full information, you know, of that damage. So there are certain times where governments will not release all the information, and this is sort of this interesting middle space. So I thought it'd be interesting today to pull apart all of these strings. How do we understand all this stuff? How do we come to sort of reasoned position? And how do we come to a position of faith, or how does faith help us look at this? So
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we've got a few kind of footholds to move through this conversation. So we're going to start with looking at elite network dynamics.
So to understand how conspiracy theories have become so popular, we need to understand a sociological dynamic, which is what I'm going to call elite network dynamics. Now, it's interesting. We had people asking us questions over time around the World Economic Forum, the Davos meeting, which is a gathering that is being organised as part of a sort of non-governmental body called the World Economic Forum. And they have an annual gathering in Davos, which is a resort sort of town in the Swiss Alps. And this is one of those meetings where, you know, the term the 1% gather. It's probably more than the 1%. It's probably the 1% of the 1%. So this is the world's leaders, the richest people, heads of industry, energy, weapons, information tech, Silicon Valley. All these people tend to gather each year. You know, we've had people like, you know, I mentioned Mohammed bin Salman there. You know, he's appeared at these events, US presidents, you know, people like Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan. You'll have, you know, people like Jeff Bezos from Amazon. This is where all those people are. You know, Xi Jinping has you know, appeared here. So it's like, who are the top people who run the world? And they gather in this place.
Yeah.
Now, before this, you know, so it's become a bit of a magnet for conspiracy theories. Now, before this, people looked at other types of gatherings. There was the Bilderberg Group, which people used to gather, which is another sort of transnational gathering of elites.
Yeah.
You've had people look at things like the Trilateral Commission. You've got, you know, Alex Jones, the sort of, you know, conspiracy theorist, sort of snuck into a meet. There's an old video where he snuck into this gathering that happens, which is more around American business leaders and business leaders on the West Coast, called Bohemian Grove. It's this like club which goes way back, right back to sort of, you know, probably over 100 years. So any sort of gathering where elites get together to discuss, you know, things, we're naturally interested in that. And they're naturally fulcrum points of why that would be something that conspiracy theories would gather around. And so there is, you know, this sense that there is this sort of reality that people are grasping at with such events. And part of, I think, what this is that there increasingly is in a globalized world, these transnational entities that are bigger than states.
Yeah.
And this tends to undermine some of what we believe about ourselves. And I'll come back to that in a second. But what you see in the world is that, you know, we've talked about networks. You can go back to one of our early sort of series where we talked about network dynamics. And when things are decentralized, it's just inevitable in nature, when you study networks in nature, that actually what grows up is what's called aristocratic networks, that there tends to be points of centralization. Some of the mistakes that people make about decentralization is that decentralization just continues to an end point and everything just constantly decentralizes.
Yeah.
Actually, what you see is more that there's a centralization, a decentralization, a return to centralization and decentralization.
Yes.
You see that throughout history. You see that throughout you know, throughout nature. And what tends to happen is you tend to get gatherings of people who have power and influence, who tend to find each other. And one of the ways that they hold on to power and influence is through gathering in elite groups.
Yes. Okay.
Now, part of our Christopher Hayes is actually he's he's a journalist on MSNBC, and that may, write him off to a lot of our audience who may not like MSNBC. But he actually wrote this interesting book about networks, and he made this point in it, which I think stands regardless of whatever you think of him politically, is that what you'll have is networks tend to go through this dynamic where you've got these two things happening in Western cultures. You've got values of equality and egalitarianism and inclusivity, and then you've got network dynamics. So, for example, let's use the United States. In the United States, I think it was Edith Wharton who chronicled a lot of elite life, over 100 years ago in the Gilded Age. They talked about, I think it was the 300s or the 400s, where in her ballroom of her home, mansion, I think it was in New York or somewhere like this, it fitted 300 or 400 people. And so the 300 or 400 people that would get invited to her dances, that was America's elites.
Yeah.
And so you often will see that this is a form of having an aristocracy. So in Britain, say, or France pre-revolution, you had an aristocracy, and that was written into the social order.
Yes.
So in countries which tend to be more democratic, tend to see themselves as more egalitarian, you have these orders grow up. Now, and many of those initial orders in the United States were primarily Anglo-Saxon, white. They tended to have a racial dynamic. They tended to have a class dynamic. And as culture goes through different sort of, movements towards greater inclusivity, you slowly saw the circle of the elites open. So, for example, John F. Kennedy, when he ran for the presidency, there was a huge issue with John F. Kennedy, which wouldn't affect anyone now. He was Catholic. He was Irish Catholic.
Yeah.
And that was a huge thing at the time. Like, people today in the United States would probably struggle to imagine that someone who was Irish Catholic would not be accepted. But there were places where Irish Catholics were cut out of a lot of life. And so to have an Irish Catholic president was a huge shock. So you see this slow integration of different groups. Jewish people were restricted from a lot of these groups. You wouldn't see that today. So Christopher Hayes makes this interesting point that what happens is elite groupings will become more inclusive over time. They may become more, have men and women. They may become more racially diverse. They may have, different backgrounds join them. But then there's still this dynamic that at the end of the day, elite groups protect themselves and will often still, though, be extremely exclusive.
Yes.
So if they're fully inclusive, they're no longer an elite group, and they lose their ability to, coalesce power in one particular place. So there's always this sense that somewhere there is this elite group that you're not part of who seem to be controlling the world. And this actually gives us a sense of feeling powerless. And we'll get back to that. I think that there is, people ask the question, is there, an agenda around the World Economic Forum, and what you'll see is the World Economic Forum is a neoliberal. Again, if you want to know more about neoliberalism, go back to our neoliberalism series. But what you began to see is, particularly in the sort of second half of the 20th century, is a lot of these transnational think tanks, NGOs, which wanted to push a free market identity in the world, also free market ideology in the world. And this is where a lot of governments, people who owned large amounts of capital, started to see as a way of organizing so that they weren't necessarily restricted to being taxed or come under governmental control. So is there an agenda with the World Economic Forum? There definitely is, which is to create a sort of free market, globalized world. Now, one of the things that happened with the World Economic Forum as well is that, the leader of it, who there's an element where Klaus Schwab, who I think because of his accent and the way that he talks, sort of almost finds himself the natural sort of imaginary villain of a sort of, planetary wire. If you're gonna design someone who would be leading a sort of conspiratorial elite, you probably would have the accent of Klaus Schwab. But Klaus Schwab is a German, although he's lived in Switzerland most of his life and his roots are Swiss. But really what the World Economic Forum is a translocational free market entity, which really is designed to keep a lot of the money in the Swiss banking system. Yeah, that's one of their big goals. Now, he's written different books. Like when COVID hit, he wrote a book called The Great Reset, which was his imagining, and there was a sense at Davos that increasingly there was a frustration at globalization. They could sense populism coming. So he wrote this book around, and also they also saw that technology, automation, AI was going to change the world. So he's trying to get out ahead and sort of shape a new future around something called the fourth industrial revolution, and that there's this chance to reset. He's got these other theories like stakeholder capitalism, which I'm not going to go into, but also because he's trying to shape global government. He has something also called the World Economic sort of Forum Young Leaders Program.
Okay.
People like Jacinta Ardern, I think Justin Trudeau, but even then sort of right-wing figures like Javier Milei in Argentina has been part of this program. So it naturally lends itself to people saying, hang on, why is this transnational organization of really rich people that I have nothing to do with and I can't vote for controlling my life? That's really the essence.
Yes.
That's natural, fertile ground there for conspiracy theories. So then, when that's not spoken about, you're going to lend yourself to conspiracy theories. So this is where that middle ground, where if like, no, don't talk about that. These people are going to have best interests in heart. That's fine. Or the other extreme of like, Klaus Schwab wants to put nanobots in our bodies through through vaccines or something like this is the extreme of it. But I think the other element too is there's a sense too that elite networks, people get frustrated at hypocrisy. So one of the things around the World Economic Forum is that people get frustrated by is the sense that they're pushing many green initiatives, but then there's the photos every year of all the private jets landing in, Davos Airport or whatever. Or, there's an interesting book, I think it's one of the best books on Davos, written by Peter Goodman, who I think was the economics reporter for the New York Times. It was called Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. And, he talks about, I think he goes to a women's leadership forum about empowering women in the world, but then comes out of it and, sees in the sort of lounges just all these women who have been brought, many from Eastern Europe, who are basically brought as sort of, sex workers, and used because all these elites are flying in, and the hypocrisy, really, he feels it being there. So that's what drives people insane. So effectively, the World Economic Forum is a gathering of the world's most powerful people in Switzerland to benefit the Swiss banking system and to keep the flow of capital around the world and to shape the next phase of capitalism.
Okay. It's helpful to understand that context. The next sort of point that we'll move to is a classic Marx line, corruption eats ideology for breakfast.
Yeah. So I think the other thing that you'll see a growth in conspiracy theories and probably more apocalyptic conspiracy theories when corruption is evident. Now, so much of the last, 6-7 years of culture war has been about polarization. What polarization is about a binary between two competing ideologies. That has been boiled down into a left versus right thing, or in the popular imagination, a sort of woke versus alt-right, whatever, this versus national, globalism versus nationalism, all these shorthands that people have in the popular imagination. But one thing that's really interesting is that one of the things that marks global culture is corruption. And, that what ideology does is ideology gives you this metaphysical interpretation to understand the world. Those people are bad, those people are good. What do I do with this thing? What do I do with Gaza? Where does this fit? When we did our first sort of Gaza episode, and it was actually before Gaza, it was really just after October the 7th, very quickly you'll see that an event happens and then it will be quickly arranged into it's either in this camp or that camp.
Yes.
And you've seen the issue in Israel and Gaza splitting the right and splitting the left.
Yes.
So very quickly, it's almost like what the left-right thing is like a sorting machine for a new thing that comes into the world. So that movie Don't Look Up,
Yes.
in that movie they showed that well where, there's a asteroid heading towards the world that's going to destroy the world, and very quickly it becomes a partisan polarized issue, So like it goes into the sorting machine and there's a sort of right-wing faction which are like, don't look up, ignore it, just enjoy your life. Now, there's a book which I recommend called McMafia by Misha Glenny, and it's a fascinating book. And really what he charts is corruption and organized crime across the world and just the sheer massive scale of it. Everything from what we would understand as mafias, cartels, anything from like the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, which sells drugs transnationally, to the Russian mafia, to the Yakuza in Japan, to the Sicilian mafia, to then also just the level of white collar crime and how these terrorist networks, white collar crime, financial crime, and organized crime all interlink in this universe, and just how much of the global economy is actually based in this, which is phenomenal.
Okay.
And so when you read this book, one thing that it absolutely does, it puts any ideological concepts that you have into a paper shredder and just shreds them. So in the books, you'll find left and right wing militant groups working together to sell drugs. You'll find groups that are fighting each other, totally racially opposed to each other, then working together for profit. And what it does is it shows you that so ideology and a lot of these ways which you understand the world, does it make sense? 100%. Does it explain part of the world? Yes, but it does not explain the whole world. Some of what happens in the world is around corruption. Now, one way, giving this an example is we'll talk about Russia and we'll say, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was I think he owned Yukos, one of the big oil companies. He was arrested by Putin, and people will describe him as an oligarch. Roman Abramovich, who owned the Chelsea Football Club, another Russian successful business person, we'll call him an oligarch. But Jeff Bezos, we won't call an oligarch. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Now, if Jeff Bezos was in Russia and bought one of the leading newspapers to communicate his political acumen, or, we might say Rupert Murdoch, both on the left and right, we would probably call them oligarchs if they were Russian. So there's this element that we look at things differently, and particularly in the West, we're not as attuned to high levels of corruption. But the West has high levels of corruption. And so when corruption happens, it's so demoralizing because it undermines many of our ideological beliefs, and particularly when it happens on your side.
Yes.
And you see that people then have to sort of come up for an explanation, and particularly to you look at, say, the economic system in the world, the effect of offshore accounting and all of this, a lot of what is happening in the world, the revelations of the Panama Papers and the others, which showed of how much in the world there was just so much corruption happening at high levels. When you look at that, it's incredibly demoralizing. So what begins to happen is conspiracy theories, you begin to see everything as corrupted and all organizations are involved in high levels of corruption. So wherever there is corruption and ideology is undermined by corruption, that's fertile ground for people to begin to see everything through a conspiracy theory lens.
Okay. Well, it's prime real estate then, isn't it? The next one. The Noble Lie and Empowered Individuals. Yeah.
Okay, so I talked about the attack on Darwin during World War II in Australia. And the Australian government, whoever making decisions at that time, would have made the decision to not inform the Australian public for what they saw was the greater good. The people who are probably making the decisions to not release all of the files on September 11th in the US government, or even the JFK assassination, despite it being so long ago, would be doing that because they believe that's in the nation's best interests. And that would be termed the noble lie. The fact that, do you tell your kids everything, when they're too young to appreciate it? Does an organization share how bad things may be going because it's going to demoralize the workers and they think we could get past this? So there's an element where leaders and organizations and those in power will sometimes lie, but they don't see it as the lie of corruption. They see it actually as a virtuous lie.
Yes.
And so there is that dynamic, which is a part of statecraft. It's a part of government. It's a reality. Now, alongside that, that's just a dynamic that happens in the world. Now, alongside that, you've also got, particularly in the West, in global culture, what you've seen, we talk a lot about the last 30 years, in the context of the last 30 years, is the rise of the empowered individual. The individualism has intensified. The individual has lived in a platform society where I can write on the Facebook wall of a large corporation and expect to get a response. I can go to my boss and say, what about this? And so we're used to a very responsive form of communication with power, and that's made even more intense in democracies. Yes. In democracies, we believe in democracy, or most people believe in democracy do so because they believe it holds power to account. and that therefore it's a way of seeking transparency from governments. And if we don't like a government, we don't feel that they're being transparent or we feel they're corrupt, we can vote them out of power.
Yep.
So increasingly the individual has become empowered, and the language in popular culture is leaders, talk to your people, share with them, get the bad news out first. But that's not how governments work. So we live in a world where we have the noble lie, which has happened always throughout history, still happens, but the difference with now is increasingly empowered individualism. So what happens is when you start to realize that, hang on, my society is not telling me everything, and they're possibly doing that for my benefit, people don't even necessarily see that, it begins to make you feel cosmically small. Now, when you believe in the ideology that you're the empowered individual, it gives you a sense of personal agency.
Yeah.
When you begin to realize, like, my government can do a war, they can do an incursion in a foreign country, they can deal in a deal that I actually feel is corrupt, or they can do a lockdown, or they can do this, or they can do that. They can have conscription in the military.
Yeah.
You begin to realize, like, hang on, I haven't got the agency that I thought I did. Now, again, let's go back to Davos. Here in Australia, what's more powerful? Probably the meeting at Davos is more powerful than what happens in the Australian Parliament. And that's challenging. Now, if you vote in the American election, you're voting in the most powerful person on earth. Maybe if you are voting in we don't vote in China, and the Russian elections, are interesting. But there's a sense that most of the people in the world, and most people listening from the variety of countries that listen, are in countries which these big organizations, like probably ExxonMobil is bigger than some of the countries listening here, or Apple, or, these different large companies. So and then when you bring a conglomeration of those large companies together at something like Davos, the World Economic Forum, or whatever, these international bodies, you begin to realize, hang on, we don't have as much say as we thought that we did. And that creates a loss of agency. Now, where conspiracy theories can come in there is that it begins to give you a story as to why you have a loss of agency. Instead of going, well, I'll explain it this way. I don't know if you've ever heard the experience, you both grew up in the country where you go out and there's not the light pollution, and you stand in a paddock or in the middle of nowhere and you're like, my goodness, look at the stars.
Yeah.
And you're just like, I'm tiny, and those things are just the gazillions of light years away, and you're like, wow, okay. Now, often that actually opens up, I think, a bit of a spiritual window, you're like, oh, wow, what is my story in this? I don't really matter. I'm just a speck. You have this sense of God often, this spiritual reality. A lot of people feel that. What we have is that most people throughout history have also had a similar understanding of social smallness. That actually, if you have a cosmic smallness, when you look at the stars, when you begin to realize, like, man, like, what I think actually doesn't matter. Governments are going to do what governments are going to do. They're going to tell noble lies. Yeah, I can vote. And particularly as you feel disempowered in those things, institutions delegitimize. Conspiracy theories are like, this is you're not voting because this is happening and these people are conspiring or, doing conspiracies, or we can blame those people over there. So really what a lot of this is about is, as the world has become more complex, it's harder to run. We feel more disempowered. And that idea that you're an empowered individual consumer and you can just like turn the channel and get a different government when you want in a different world.
Yeah.
We're starting to see, like, hang on, that's really difficult. I'll add one more thing. I think there's a unique American dynamic to this.
Okay.
Now, I think America is going to influence the world, particularly English-speaking world, but the whole of the world, because it really does control the big tech platforms. It controls Hollywood. It controls publishing. It controls media, television, more than any other country in the world. So it gets to tell the story in the world as the world's preeminent superpower. Now, America has this vision, very different to other countries, in that it has a understanding of itself, of really a country that's not just born out of, hey, they happen to be on that land and they've always been there, as it's really a republic of ideas. Being an American is believing in particular ideas. And so, America starts as almost this sort of vision of this sort of Jeffersonian noble farmers in this utopia who've created this wonderful way of living. And for a long time, America wouldn't have armies, and, it had armies, but they sort of had citizens' armies, or, even, the OSS when it was created, which would then become the CIA, They didn't want to have it. When the FBI was resisted because they thought it would be a sort of secret police Gestapo unit. So there's this sense of America is different to other countries, does things differently, and we're the light on the hill. It has a messianic vision. And not just a messianic vision internationally, but also a messianic vision of what it is to be a citizen of America. It's almost like being a citizen of Rome and getting to vote in the Senate. And it's a very different conception of the country. Now, the last half century or more, Eisenhower warned about the rise of an industrial military complex near the end of his presidency. And what he was really talking about was the rise of what is an American security state. That also, if you are the most powerful country in the world, you also have to maintain that through having the most powerful military in the world, the most powerful economic machine in the world, and the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world.
Yes.
And so what you've seen over the last half century is the rise of an incredibly powerful military, unlike the world has ever seen, a security state, unlike the world has ever seen. And that sits alongside the democratic vision of a republic of virtue.
Yeah.
Now, that creates an inner contradiction. Now, what I find really interesting is when you look at so much of the sort of conspiracy theory information, movies, whenever there's a UFO story, there's always the Air Force come and tell someone not to look at it. The UFOs are seen near bases. There's this constant intertwining when you look at conspiracy theories in so many of their forms that come out of the American milieu, that the security state is not far behind it.
Yeah.
And this is where the Turkish term, the deep state, then arises, which is the idea that whilst there's the democratic ideals of America, that also in Washington, in somehow, in almost this untouchable way, we feel like there's this other power that's really operative. And look, there is truth to this. There is, you read American history, there are times when, you've got different factions. You've got the Pentagon, you've got, the National Security Council, you've got Wall Street. There are multiple centers of power. And what that can make the average individual feel is like, hang on, I don't have the agency. I'm looking at this giant thing. So when Donald Trump says, I want to, drain the swamp, that has tremendous resonance with people because it gets at the heart of what it feels like, that inner contradiction of we're meant to be something different than what we are now.
Yes.
And I don't think we have that as Australians in the same way.
No.
I wouldn't think New Zealanders or Swedes would or whatever. And that's not to say there's not conspiracy theories in our countries, but I think that's central to so much. There's an interesting book on this by Timothy Malley called The Covert Sphere, Secrecy, Fiction, and the National Security State. And I think he just gets at that idea that if you look at so many spy movies and this is why on the left, there's lots of conspiracy theories around the CIA and intelligence agencies and how they've sort of stopped socialism in America. Is there some truth to that? Absolutely. There was COINTELPRO, which was tracking civil rights leaders and stuff like this. Martin Luther King was being observed by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, J. Edgar Hoover. There was the Church Committee, which looked at the influence of the CIA on American politics. There was the Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan presidency, that there have been elements of the American security state which have done things which seem contra to democracy. So that internal contradiction is there. And I think while that's there, that's going to continue to generate a milieu in which conspiracy theories will flourish. And because it's hard to look at that in a very sort of cold way of going, this is just part of the contradiction of what is to be the world's preeminent superpower, most people won't do that. It's hard to hold that tension. And so conspiracy theories will flourish in all their different forms. Can I add one more thing too?
Yes.
Sorry. The other thing I would say too is that there's an interesting book called Pale Horse Rider, William Cooper, The Rise of Conspiracy and the Fall of Trust in America by Mark Jacobson. And he talks about, there's been different sort of conspiracy, figures. Like you got someone like Alex Jones today, but before him was like Art Bell, who was on the radio. And there was William Cooper, sort of these people in the middle of nowhere doing these late night programs. And, one thing he talks about that and is really interesting is that, there's the interplay too with, many minorities who feel disempowered. There's a sense where in those milieus too, that conspiracy theories can thrive, because there is a sense. And again too, because they are often facing structural realities in their culture, which do keep them excluded. So there's an element in that book where he talks about how often the language of conspiracy theories, this is me interpreting what he's saying, but the language of conspiracy theories, although many of the sort of answers that it had wrong, did touch many people who found themselves. So William Cooper wrote this book, Pale Horse Rider, but apparently for a period in prisons in the United States, that was the second most requested book after the Bible. Because for people who have been imprisoned, who feel like their race is this whole structure has kept them excluded because of their race in that society. There is a sense where you understand that there are often the democratic promises are often let down, that there are these structures which work against you. So there's an element here too where you can sort of, there's some sympathy that I think you can have why people believe when they lose agency, why they actually can find themselves in a position of questioning many things. I think that's an important note to make.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful other perspective of where conspiracy theories emerge from.
Yes. I was just going to say, to not just, I think part of the thing is whilst you may not agree with the answers, there does need to be some sympathy that people who are powerless are going to find themselves reaching for these sort of answers. So I think often people have been laughed at, joked at, and some of the stuff in Pale Horse Rider, it's crazy, But what I like about that book is he says, people who have often been powerless, you can understand. So there's a sympathy here.
Yes. And I was just, we don't have to necessarily leave this in, but it's just a reflection of, particularly when you were talking about empowered individuals and even some of the elite network dynamics, thinking about how people are approaching what's happening, like the restriction of particular pieces of information. I think about it at a more, relational level. So like 3 people in the room and like one person is withholding a piece of information and the other 2 people are like, oh, what's going on? Why is this playing out? And this is just, our spheres have, because of, globalization and the way that we now interact with so many different aspects of the world, we think that we should be able to be let in on the things that everyone's being let in, that everyone should be let in on. So we approach these situations. I wonder if we approach these situations in the same way that we would with these interpersonal relationships, because there's an expectation that we should all be on the same page. And if we're not, then we start to calculate what's actually happening.
Yes.
Why is this person withholding these things? There must be something more to this situation than meets the eye.
That's a great analogy. And I think it's our uncomfortability in the contemporary world with hierarchy, because just say Daniel knew something and he's like, I can't tell us. We're like, what's he thinking? But who does he think he is? He's smiling smugly over there.
It's about custard, isn't it?
It's about custard.
I'm not saying
and we start to get paranoid. So you're right. Information and who controls the information creates a hierarchy very quickly.
100%. Well, let's move on to, we're talking about information. Information warfare.
Yeah. So all this has to be also put out that we live in a period of tremendous geopolitical conflict that's increasing. And war takes multiple forms. There's information war, economic war, political war, and then there's kinetic war, which is blowing stuff up. Now, there's probably 2 levels of kinetic war. You could say there's proxy wars, like, during the Cold War, there was a battle in Angola where the South Africans were fighting, but were getting arms from the US and the Western Bloc, and were fighting Cubans and others in Angola who were being supplied by the Soviet Union and so on. It was effectively a proxy war between the US and the Soviets. You could say something similar about Ukraine. You could say something about many other sort of battles in the world today. So we have proxy wars going on. So the first stage of kinetic war, we've got economic war, 100% going on. We've got trade war. We've got political war going on. Between really this new bloc, which would be Iran, Russia, China versus the West or NATO. And you've got information war. Now, the internet just gives the ability of information war to just go absolutely to incredible levels. So interestingly, there was this whole big sort of viral thing where, I don't know if you saw this in Paris, there was this huge fear over bed bugs in hotels and people going crazy and people it was this huge big bed bug scare in Paris a few months ago. And then the French security services came out and said basically this was a Russian disinformation campaign.
Right.
And, so we live in a world, and it's not just the Russians, the West does this too. The West, has been doing this for a long time, that in wars, people, again, this goes back to the noble lie. Hey, just say we're two countries. We can go to war or we can do information war. Like I'm going to do information war because it's not killing people in the same way. So we also live in a time where there's just mass information war. And that's countries doing that. It's blocks, it's political ideologies. And conspiracy theories then, even releasing conspiracy theories. So QAnon, many people have speculated, is a form of information warfare. Was it released to delegitimize, to create civil unrest in the US? Was it released because it was released around? It's a theory around elite child trafficking networks. It was released not long after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. Who there's many things around that story that possibly that was an intelligence operation. So. Who knows, but we also live in a time where all of this stuff is being magnified and used as part of information warfare at the moment. So it's really hard to know what to believe. And this is why people often say, so what's the one news source I should listen to? Yeah. There's none now. Everything is part of the ABC in Australia is the Australian government's broadcasting. The BBC is the British government's. It's not going to release certain things, the informational space is highly, and often you'll find out, like the Grey Zone, which is sort of a left-wing anti-imperialist sort of news site, just was released the other day. It's getting funding from the Russian and Iranian governments, so you see things in Russia, which have been, or, say Ukraine, which have been sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an American government thing. There is so much money, so much influence out there. We're in the midst of an information war, which makes this really difficult.
Okay, the next point, conspiracy theories as a form of belief in secular cultures.
I think did we talk about celebrity as a form of believing? Did we talk about that? Or was that an idea I've written somewhere else?
Recently?
Yeah.
Not that I recall.
Okay, great. Check out my book, Platforms to Pillars. So this, I forget where I say certain things. Okay.
It's not that you haven't necessarily. It's just that it's not present in my mind at the moment.
There is a torrent of information.
There'll be a listener that'll be like, yes, episode this.
Yes. Yeah. Chris Rojek is a sociologist, written a lot about celebrity. And he just made this really interesting thing, is that celebrity is a way that religion stays present in secular societies. People will grab merchandise of Taylor Swift like she's this medieval saint. They'll make pilgrimage to the Taylor Swift concert. They'll swoon and scream and cry like it's a moment of religious euphoria at the concert. Now, I would say in the same way that conspiracy theories are a form of belief. It's a metaphysic. It's a great overarching belief that enables us to act religiously in a secular culture. You'll meet people who are atheistic, but they'll believe in these great stories. It's an explanation for sin. Like, this is happening. I don't have this job, or society's going this direction because these evil powers are doing this. And also because, again, America, I think, always has this religious dimension to it, even when it thinks it's not being religious.
Yeah.
That the sort of Christian contours of certain things, the apocalypticism, that messianicism is sort of like end times. You hear some conspiracy theories, it's not being told by Christians, but it feels like an end times eschatological sort of like shaping. The use of spiritual warfare language you see now in many places. And this is not just in the West. You look at the Aum Shinrikyo cult, which, did a chemical weapons attack on the Japanese subway, Falun Gong or Falun Dafa, the Chinese apocalyptic sect, that you see in many of the sort of cults that are connected to sort of conspiracy theories. There is religious elements. So I think that conspiracy theories offer us a means to speak spiritually. Now, again, I think conspiracy theories can be extremely damaging. And we have had people, I just want to say, we've had people write in whose family members have gone down the rabbit hole in QAnon. So we get that, and the damage. I've sat with people 100% believe that.
Yeah.
But in another way too, this is also a sign that as the sort of secular story is falling over, conspiracy theories are a signal that the religious is returning, the irrational, the spiritual. So accompanying that too is that it creates some spiritual openness in people. Is it all good? No. Is some of it terrible? Yes. But there's also a sense of spiritual openness that people are like, hang on, there's something more here. There's an evil in the world. Hang on. This is not how it's meant to be. There seems to be forces that I can't get at.
It's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. And I think, from a Christian perspective, we're made in God's image and God is writing this narrative.
Yes.
And if we are made in his image, if we're not following him, we're finding other narratives
Yes.
to live out of and live into. The final point that you have here is a theology of conspiracy theories.
Yeah. So I think this follows really neatly on from what we were just saying, that in Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament, you have this theology of the chaos monsters that, in Job, it talks about Leviathan. I think it's Tannin, I think is the word in Hebrew for these monster. The sea was seen as this chaotic place, that the sea is chaos, the primal chaos as we see it in Genesis. And there's always this fear in Israel that the sea is going to break its bounds and come flooding over the earth. Again, we see that in the Great Flood, and that in the sea there's these monsters like Rahab and Leviathan, which reflect the chaos in the world, that chaos is always threatening to burst forth. And, you have this imagery of God defeating chaos. It's, called in theology in German, the Chaos Camp, the struggle with chaos. And I think that this moment of sort of social smallness, of feeling tiny compared to the chaos in the world, I think what lots of people are struggling with at the moment is a sense that the chaos monsters have returned.
Yeah.
That the world's not going how we thought it, that there's environmental disaster, that there's geopolitical disaster. Psalm 2 talks about, why do the nations rage? They're almost becoming chaos monsters. It's interesting, the story of the chaos monsters actually feature a lot in the book of Exodus. That some of the words that are translated, like the staff turned into a serpent, actually is translated in the Hebrew, I think it's Tannin, into like the sea monster that, the Nile, it was seen that Pharaoh had command over the Nile. He was almost like a god controlling the chaos of the world. And the plagues coming against the Nile is sort of like, no, you're not in control. And even the exit from Egypt, when they walk through the sea, it's almost like Pharaoh and his men are being killed in the sea, like God defeating the chaos monster in the sea and parting the sea for a way through. And I feel like there is this sense that that's what's happening in the world, that the leaders of the world are like Pharaoh and they're struggling to hold back inflation, living costs, war in Ukraine, all these things. And they're sort of almost aspirations of godlike control of the world to create this perfectly ordered, like a Swiss clock. There's a nice tie back to Davos. The world system to work like this Swiss clock and this beautiful progressive world that we just inch towards, that has been humiliated, just as Pharaoh's pretense to control the Nile has been humiliated. And that God actually also, though, that these moments where chaos seems to happen are also moments of decreation. The plagues can also be seen as God decreating Egypt, because it set itself against God, and that Pharaoh saw himself as a god and tried to create a society of God men. And so there's a sense too that when these moments happen, it's a form of judgment against the secular powers of the world. So I think there's actually a really interesting evangelistic opportunity. I think there's something for us here to do a sort of public theology, a missiology, if you like, of, how do we, God is there are principalities and powers in the world. There's a lot of people who I think are more open to hearing that now than perhaps they were 15 years ago as they look at the world, the sense that there are powers beyond our reach, that it's not, Klaus Schwab is not, doing some ritual in some back room somewhere at Davos, that actually there are spiritual powers in the world that are set against God, but that on the cross, Jesus humiliated them. Colossians tells us that Jesus is going to have the ultimate victory, that there is almost a fear in earthly projects which drives so much of conspiracy theories, but that Jesus has actually had victory, and we have confidence in him, and God's going to God wins at the end of the day, and the New Jerusalem is going to come, and there's nothing in the world that is going to stop that. That gates of hell should not prevail against the church. And so I think that there is a rich evangelistic terrain here for us to head into to share the gospel if we're truly attuned to what is going on.
And I think also, just on another note, the hope that can be found in, looking at that Exodus story and how when you're talking about the chaos that's represented by the waters and in the waters, God brings the people through the waters.
Yes.
So even though we as his people now are experiencing the tumult of the powers of the world, these chaos monsters, as you called them, God will bring his people through. This is what he is faithful to, and he's done it time and time again throughout the entire biblical narrative, and he continues to do it now.
100%.
Yeah. Right. Well, thanks for joining us today. I think we recorded for longer than we intended, but it was, some really helpful exploration there, Mark. Thank you very much for that. If you would like to get a little bit more of a conversation from us about this episode, we have our subscriber chats, which you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and subscribing there. And we send it a few days after the episode is released. Thanks for joining us.